A new poll is giving insight at how Democrats see their 2020 candidates. Gallup asked Democrats and Democratic-leaning independents about 7 of the highest polling presidential hopefuls. And as you can see, former Vice President Joe Biden and Vermont Senator Bernie Sanders are in a tier of their own right now. 3/4 of respondents view them favorably. But on the other hand, more than 40% don't know who South Bend, Indiana Mayor Pete Buttigieg is. Well, since Biden entered the race 3 weeks ago, Sanders has taken little time to tell voters what sets him apart from the former VP.
Joe and I have very different pasts in terms of how we have voted and very different vision for the future. And that is something that we should be discussing. For example, all right, I voted against the war in Iraq. In fact, helped lead the opposition to what turned out to be the worst foreign policy disaster in the modern history of America. Joe voted for it. I voted against NAFTA. I voted against permanent normal trade relations with China, 2 trade agreements which cost us millions of good-paying jobs. Joe supported those agreements.
In fact, the Sanders campaign even pulled out a video called Bernie's Record versus Biden. And after a voter in Iowa said that she was trying to decide between the two.
How are you different than Biden?
Let me answer that in a couple of ways.
Well, joining me from Washington with more is Democratic strategist Lynda Tran, and here with me in New York, CBSN political reporter Caitlin Huey-Burns. Okay, Caitlin, we saw Sanders talk about Biden. Has Biden weighed in about Sanders at this point?
You know, he really hasn't. And I've talked to Biden allies and Bernie allies about this. And in a lot of ways, they kind of need each other in this campaign. Bernie folks say that he's not going to go after Biden on anything personal, but he wants to be able to draw the contrast on policy. You heard him do that there, and he has been repeating those lines because he thinks that Biden can be an effective foil for him. By the same turn, the Biden folks see Bernie Sanders as a foil as well, at a time where the president of the United States, Donald Trump, is trying to paint all Democrats as socialists. Biden thinks that by having Bernie in this race, he can show contrasts with him on policy differences and kind of say, look, I'm more of the middle of the road type of person who can take on Donald Trump. But interestingly enough, given how far apart they are on issues and personality, and they only overlapped for 2 years in the Senate, they are also targeting similar voters. So they're campaigning in places like Pennsylvania, Michigan, these areas where Democrats who voted for Obama then voted for Trump, these voters that Democrats want to get back again. So very different strategies, very different personalities, very different policies, but going after similar voters. And we'll see how that pans out.
Lynda, is there a sense as to what could separate these two men, get one a little further out of the gate than the other?
I think that they're actually very, very different. And what we're witnessing right now is Bernie Sanders reacting to how much Joe Biden has really shaken up the dynamics of the race. You know, in 2016, Bernie Sanders had the opportunity to really cast himself as the outsider, the anti-establishment candidate, despite the fact that he had been in Capitol Hill for nearly 3 decades. That was his role and his framing. And a lot of the ideas that he set forward, whether it was free college or Medicare for all, these were all groundbreaking notions and really pushed the conversation in a direction that it probably wouldn't have gone if it had not been for Bernie Sanders. This time around, a lot of the candidates that are in the field, nearly all 22 of them, honestly, have been talking about some of those issues as part of their overall platforms, as part of their vision for the country. So the only way for Bernie Sanders to really make clear that he deserves to be at the top of the field, as you were pointing out from the poll, is to really differentiate himself from Joe Biden. Joe Biden has been very clear that he is somebody who is looking for common ground. He is, somebody in his longstanding history has shown himself to want to be able to work with the other side of the aisle, which is very different from Bernie Sanders. And so you're seeing him make use of that now.
You know, Caitlin, last go round, Bernie Sanders versus Hillary Clinton, when you look at that, so many people thought he was just too far to the left. And I'm always struck by something you told me a couple weeks ago, that when you talk to folks, when you're on the ground in Iowa, they keep telling you electability is so important for first in the nation. They want to make sure whoever they push forward is someone who can beat Donald Trump.
Right. And Bernie Sanders' presence in this race does show for Joe Biden how different the party is, how much it's changed just even in the past couple of years. Lynda pointed to a lot of these issues that were once considered fringe, Medicare for all, and other items now kind of mainstream in the party. You're going to see, you already have seen Bernie Sanders also bring up Biden's Iraq war vote. That could also be an issue of contention. But by the same token, you know, we've had all of these litmus tests that Democrats have been trying to get on board with, and Biden really hasn't engaged in a lot of those conversations and instead has really kept his focus on Donald Trump. So you're seeing all of these other campaigns try to compete with Biden as the front runner. You're seeing that in their fundraising pitches. You're seeing that on their more aggressive posture, I would say, on the campaign trail to Donald Trump, and also some slight, subtle and not so subtle digs at each other, again, trying to differentiate themselves.
Caitlin mentioned the Iraq War. There's a Politico Morning Consult poll that finds that nearly 3 in 10 Democrats, that's more than 40% of participants between the ages of 18 and 29, say that his record on this issue makes them less likely to support him. But Lynda, do people really vote on foreign policy when they go to the ballot box?
You know, I think people vote on both foreign policy and on domestic policy. And I think that, you know, when we evaluate young voters that are going to be participating in the Democratic primary, much less in the general election, we have to be really careful not to assume that they're going to vote based on a single issue, whether it's the Iraq War or anything else. I do think it's interesting that when Bernie Sanders was running last go around, he had a lot of strength among young voters. And so no question he's going to be really hammering on this issue of the Iraq war vote now, because it'll help him with some of the numbers. But, you know, Joe Biden, I mean, what Caitlin's talking about is he has the luxury of being far, far ahead of everybody else in the field. You know, the polls really have only gotten better for him since he announced his candidacy just nearly about 3 weeks ago. And so he's running as a front runner runs. You know, he is setting this up to be a contrast between him and Donald Trump versus him, as opposed to him and the other Democratic candidates in the field. I think some of this is going to certainly change over the next few weeks. Once we see them on the Democratic debate stage, they will have to talk about how they differ on a whole slate of issues, and it won't just be about the Iraq War.
Hey, Lynda, speaking of the debate stage, you know, the Democratic Party has gone to great lengths to say, hey, look at our contenders. What a diverse field. We've got women, we've got people of color. But when you look at the front running tier, it's all white men. Is the Democratic Party concerned about that? And are voters, does it matter to them?
I don't know if it matters to Democratic primary voters so much. I think that what the Democratic primary voters care most about is somebody that they think is going to beat Donald Trump at all costs. Now, when you see them all standing up on stage, however, and you've got the, you know, septuagenarians on the one hand and you've got the 40-somethings and on the other, it is going to raise the question of, you know, what kind of party do we want to be? Are we a forward-looking one that, you know, elevates young leaders with fresh ideas, or are we one that is looking for experience, especially after, you know, a tumultuous 2 years of a Donald Trump presidency? I think that that's going to be very, very apparent on the stage, and that we're going to see how people respond to it.
When you talk about Biden and you talk about Bernie Sanders, Caitlin, we haven't heard Biden speak directly about Sanders, but he did weigh in with New York Congresswoman Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, criticized Biden for the report that he was looking for middle of the ground on climate change. I want to play for you a bite. You'll hear from Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez first about the Green New Deal event with Bernie Sanders, and then you're going to hear from Biden, who was in New Hampshire yesterday.
So often, you know, when folks, particularly conservatives on both sides of the aisle, say, Green New Deal is, quote, too much, or too extreme, or too radical. No middle ground. No middle ground is right.
You've never heard me say middle of the road. I've never been in the middle of the road on the environment. And I tell her to check, the statements that I made and look at my record. She'll find that nobody has been more consistent about taking on the environment and the green revolution than I have.
Do you get the a sense, Caitlin, that these Democratic contenders are worried about AOC, or is it really much ado about nothing?
Well, she's certainly proving to be a force and injecting a real debate within the party that's more about approach than it really is about policy. There isn't that much of a difference among all of these candidates when it comes to policy. They all believe, especially in climate change, that it is a top concern and needs to be addressed. The difference, though, is how aggressively they're going after it. On that issue and then on other issues in terms of rhetoric. You heard Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez echo what I've been hearing from a lot of primary voters, which is that they don't want to seek middle ground. They really want to take this fight directly to the president, and they don't believe that the president or Republicans have been acting in good faith. Then you have Democrats like Joe Biden, who are used to a different kind of Washington and a different kind of Senate when he was in it, where he could work across the aisle, where as vice president he went to the Senate lunches and struck deals with Republicans. The base of the party is kind of saying this is not how we have been seeing this Republican Party. So I think you're going to see this contrast drawn a lot more on style than really on substance.
Caitlin Huey-Burns and Lynda Tran, I want to thank you ladies both for joining us today.
Thank you.